Everybody in the room and online too. Um, I definitely wanted to give this talk today because I know no matter who we are, we can't help but be affected by all of the changes and challenges going on around us. Whether it's political difficulty, social division, economic upset, or environmental destruction. There's a lot of unique challenges that we face as individuals and a community. So I wanted to learn, what can we glean from our spiritual teachers and the teachings of the Buddha to help us navigate these times. And first of all, even though sometimes things may seem very dark, scary, upsetting, it is actually a time of great opportunity. There's the old saying that the darkest day is before the dawn. And in a lot of cases, this seems to be true, that any act of evil in the world actually evokes a compassionate and caring response from others. We've seen this throughout history. It used to be common to own people as slaves, but over time, our ancestors organized together to end the mistreatment of others. And so, just like people in the past have faced difficulty and created change, we can do the exact same thing. Now, the Buddha in the Dhammapada speaks to this. He said, "If a man foolishly does me wrong, I will return to him the protection of my boundless love. The more evil comes from him, the more good shall go from me." And this really points to the fact that we can't fight hatred with hatred. We can't end anger with anger. We can heal with love and the power of compassion, no matter what challenges we face. So during times like these, the three jewels are more important than ever. And Michael mentioned them earlier during our chant. We've got the Buddha that includes the historical figure, Gautama Buddha, who lived a really long time ago. But we've also got the living Buddha nature within ourselves. And this is such an amazing tool to have at this time because there may be a lot of messages out in the world that tell us what to do, what to believe, how to act. But by going and connecting within, we can rely on our inner Buddha, our inner wisdom to guide us through any challenges. And we can use the life of the historical Buddha as an example of compassion and action. Now, the Dharma are the teachings that liberate us from suffering. And this is the tool that we can use to guide us to the place of peace within. This is the spot that Thich Nhat Hanh calls the island within the self. And it's this idea of equanimity. No matter what's going on outside of ourselves, we always have the capacity to tune into our breath and come back to the peace within, even if the external world is filled with tumult. And then, of course, the third jewel is the Sangha. And Thich Nhat Hanh, and actually Brother Chi Singh, seem to think the Sangha is one of the most important jewels. This is our community of mindfulness. This gathering together helps support us and strengthen our practice. And it also gives us the ability to organize to help others in our community by taking note of who might be in need and what sort of what we can offer to them. Now, in Buddhism, there's a key concept called prajna, which is often translated as wisdom, insight, or understanding. And with prajna, we're able to see the true nature of all phenomenon, which includes the three characteristics of all things. For one, we've got impermanence, the truth that things are always changing, good or bad, nothing will ever stay the same. We've also got the truth of suffering. The Buddha taught it is inevitable for us to experience suffering. And so when we do encounter it, we shouldn't be surprised. The third is the idea of non-self or egolessness. According to the Buddha, a lot of suffering arises from the attachment to the ego, which is an illusion of a permanent superior self. In the Sutta Nipata, the Buddha said, the conceited one who thinks himself superior, inferior, or equal to others may engage in disputes. And seeing as how we want to cultivate peace, kindness, and compassion in the world, it would be wise to avoid attaching to our ego self or our egoic nature, and instead try to focus on the idea of interbeing, the idea that we're a human family, that we truly are one, and that our thoughts, actions, and beliefs affect not only ourselves, but each other. Now, of these three characteristics of prajna, impermanence is one of the greatest blessings because it means everything changes. For example, if there's a regime, a leader that you don't like, it's going to change one day. And in fact, there's a historical example of an emperor, Ashoka the Great, who underwent great change. He lived back in 268 BC and had an empire over a large part of the Indian subcontinent. Before he became Buddhist, he had a very different reputation. Initially, he was called Kamashoka because he spent his years pursuing pleasure. Then he transformed into Chandashoka because he spent his years performing evil deeds. And then once he decided to pursue the Dharma, he became Dhammashoka, and that means Ashoka the righteous. Now, when we say he was cruel, he was extremely cruel. He would massacre, torture, burn people to death. Although some people say his cruelty is exaggerated to make his conversion story more extraordinary. But we do know that during his reign, he conquered the Kalinga region, and the destruction that he experienced during the war made him repent violence. And in the subsequent years, he was drawn towards Buddhism and felt great remorse for what he'd done. During the conquest, 100,000 men and animals were killed, 150,000 were taken captive. And later, when he repented, he decided he must follow the Dharma and not only practice it himself, but spread it to others. So after that, he had a new way of thinking. He saw the slaughter, the death, and the deportation that he caused, and he thought it was deplorable. So he took a pilgrimage to the Bodhi tree, started teaching the Dharma and performing social welfare, including establishing medical facilities, planting medicinal herbs, and digging wells to help his community. He also constructed thousands of stupas. And so he just stands as an example of impermanence. If we'd encountered him during his cruel phase, we may have thought there was no hope. But in truth, he changed over time. This also shows how our thoughts, our beliefs, and our actions are not all of who we are, because we are constantly changing. Our way of thinking, believing, and acting may change depending on what inputs we receive. Now, there's another well-known story about the Buddha's encounter with the serial killer, Angulimala. And the serial killer had been running around murdering people, and so typically people tended to react with great fear. But when the Buddha encountered him, he did not react with fear. And so Angulimala was so moved by the Buddha and his teachings, he actually abandoned his life of violence and instead chose to seek ordination to become a monk. This story highlights how the Buddha's compassion helped transform somebody who others may have said was completely hopeless. Now, thinking of impermanence, we can also think about laws. There's human laws and there's natural laws. Human laws change over time, but natural laws are inherent in the universe. Things like the transformative power of love and the healing power of compassion are natural laws. But when human laws are unjust, we're always given the option of nonviolent civil disobedience. This was shown during the civil rights movement in the United States when there was racial segregation. And many people said that's not natural law, that's human law, and it's unjust. And so, even at the risk of being arrested, they did sit ins and stood up for their rights. Now, Gandhi is a well known figure as far as nonviolent civil disobedience, and he had this idea of satyagraha, or soul force. He said it is the fundamental principle of satyagraha that the tyrant whom the satyagrahi seeks to resist has power over his body and material possessions, but he can have no power over the soul. The soul can remain unconquered and unconquerable even when the body is imprisoned. So that's the reminder that no matter what we face outside of ourselves, nobody can control our soul. We always have the choice and the power within to cultivate our own soul power, to resist anything that we see generating suffering in ourselves and in others. For Gandhi, satyagraha meant holding on to truth. This truth force was the soul or spirit. And in his mind, it excluded the use of violence because he believed man was not capable of knowing absolute truth and therefore couldn't actually punish. And he saw nonviolence as a dynamic condition. It didn't necessarily mean meek submission to the will of the evildoer, but instead putting one's whole soul against the will of the tyrant. And I believe this is a sentiment Thich Nhat Hanh would agree with. When he was alive, he lived through the Vietnam War, and he was living in a monastery from a very young age. But when the war broke out in his country, he refused to take sides. He realized if I was raised the same way as those soldiers, as those communists, as whomever, I would believe and act the same way they did. And he had some people at the monastery tell him, you don't need to help these people. Just stay on your cushion. Just meditate to enlightenment. You know, that's your job as a monk. You don't need to get out there. And he said, that's not cool. I see people suffering right now. So he created this idea of engaged Buddhism. You know, he'd still meditate, but he made sure to take compassionate action in the world. In 1965, Sister Chan Kong and Thich Nhat Hanh established the School of Youthful Social Services. And it was a social work school, and they did things like help poor villagers, create schools, build medical centers, and do things that the government wasn't providing for these people. But their work, even though it was well-intentioned, became very dangerous. As the president tried to turn South Vietnam into a Catholic country, they used state violence against the Buddhist monks and nuns. In fact, Chan Kong even saw some of her peers be persecuted, kidnapped, and murdered for their work helping the villagers. And to get themselves through, they continued to practice mindfulness to keep their hope alive. So we can consider, you know, this model of engaged Buddhism. If we see suffering in our community, what can we do to help make it right? And the thing is, Thich Nhat Hanh didn't necessarily do what the government wanted him to do. In fact, he got in some big trouble. He got a bunch of refugees on a boat, violated international law to get them to freedom. And that's why he was exiled from his home country for years. But that's also why Martin Luther King Jr. nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. And it's just a good example of doing what we know is right rather than what we're told is right. Now, it's also important to remember the enemies aren't even our enemies. Our personal views and beliefs are impermanent. We need to have compassion for others. My friend always said the phrase, there but by God's grace go I. It's the idea that I could be in somebody else's shoes and I need to have as much compassion for them as I would for me. That's why even if we disagree strongly with others and don't support their views, we can still hold compassion for them. And we can know we're not our beliefs, although our beliefs do influence our actions. They can change over time. Thich Nhat Hanh looked at this idea in his poem, Please Call Me by My True Names, which he wrote in 1976 to process difficult feelings after hearing about a 12-year-old Vietnamese girl who was raped on a boat by a pirate and then threw herself overboard to die. Thich Nhat Hanh said when he first learned of it, of course, he was angry at the pirate. He naturally took the side of the girl. But as he looked more deeply, he saw things differently. He thought, you know, if you took the side of the girl, you could just shoot the pirate. But in reality, he couldn't do that. In his meditation, he realized if he'd been born in the village of the pirate and raised in the same conditions, he would become the pirate. And he couldn't condemn himself. He also saw hundreds of babies being born into poverty and similar conditions that, if they weren't careful, would become pirates too. And he thought if you just use violence to shoot the pirate, you actually shoot all of us because we're all so interconnected. So he realized, even though every figure seems so separate, the 12-year-old, the pirate, and Thich Nhat Hanh, they should be able to recognize each other in themselves. So even though the poem shows many examples of cruel behavior, I focused on the causes and conditions that led people to act the way they did, whether they were raised in violence, poverty, or hunger. So he tried so hard to put himself in others' shoes, to soften his criticism and judgment, and to better understand what might be behind their views. Another instance of this are stories of Buddhist temples being robbed. Instead of condemning the robbers, the monks will give them money, recognizing, wow, they must need it more than we do. And coming from a place of compassion and understanding that the circumstances those people were in may have led them to act that way. But of course, that's not a free pass just to act cruelly. Wisdom calls for us to spend time with people we would like to emulate, while of course we can still hold compassion for others. In fact, the monastics in the Plum Village tradition take buddies whenever they leave the monastery to go to the real world to help them stay true to their practice and resist, the vibes of the material world. The Buddha himself stressed the importance of keeping wise and kind company and distancing yourself from those who might be harmful or deluded. In the Dhammapada, it says, do not associate with evil friends. Do not associate with the low. Associate with the virtuous. Associate with the best. Because, of course, we're going to become like the people we spend the most time with. But either way, this quality of compassion is something we can extend to everybody. In the traditional practice of metta, or loving kindness, we start by loving ourselves. This is very important because a lot of us may be personally affected by changes going on in the world. We may experience upset emotions like fear, anger, anxiety, or sadness. So, holding our emotions like a baby, we can wish ourselves, may we be happy. But the next step is to send to our loved ones. And usually it's pretty easy to generate that feeling of loving kindness for them. After that, we pick a neutral person. We may not know their life circumstances or anything about them, but we wish them well. But one of the more challenging aspects is to send the love to the despised ones, the ones we hate, the ones we disagree with. And it's still part of our practice to open our Buddha heart, to send the love to the ones that we find the most difficult. This is seen in the model of Jesus Christ. As he was hanging crucified on the cross, he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He realized they were acting out of ignorance. And it's a similar idea. If he'd been born in the same causes and conditions, perhaps he would have behaved the same way. So, as we consider our compassion and action, it's important to think about who are the vulnerable people in our community and what can we do to help these vulnerable populations. It may be taking action, it may be donating to a nonprofit, or it may just be simply being present to listen. And as we look at the global picture, we can always think locally and what can we do? Now, as we practice ourselves, our meditation will help us to find the best answers possible in our store consciousness. Our inner authority can guide us through any challenge. As long as we stay open to our intuition, our awareness, and our knowledge, our heart will guide us of ways to stay true to ourself and our values to help heal our community and the world. And thankfully, we have a great setup here at the Dallas Meditation Center. We've got some values that guide us, and I think they help us to imagine the type of world that we would want to see. So, first of all, we have our vision. We envision a North Texas community where every individual experiences peace, joy, compassion, creativity, and well-being. We don't divide or choose who's able to practice with us. We're open to all. We also affirm people of all ages, genders, ethnicities, sexual orientations, and abilities. And we're a refuge for everyone, regardless of their traditions and beliefs. As part of our practice, we also follow the 5 mindfulness trainings, and it's worth being aware of a few. With mindful consumption, we can think, where do the products come from? What's the true cost? What are we consuming through the media? Does our consumption actually support the world we want to see? We can also be aware that acts of hatred, fanaticism can divide the world. and do our best to focus on the opposite within ourselves. In addition, we are called to dana, or generosity, sharing with others when we can. And we give to food banks, volunteer, assist with any expertise we have. Every day, we can try to offer compassion and healing to at least one being. And finally, we've got a mindfulness training about reverence for life. With this one, we're determined not to kill, not to let others kill, and not to support any act of killing in the world, in our thinking, or in our way of life. You see that harmful actions arise from anger, fear, greed, and intolerance, which come from dualistic and discriminative thinking. So we can contemplate what this might mean for us. In the 1800s, Henry David Thoreau resisted the Mexican-American War by refusing to pay poll taxes that supported the war. He was ultimately arrested, but when he wrote the essay Civil Disobedience, he stated, if 1,000 men were not to pay their tax bills this year, that would not be a violent and bloody measure as it would be to pay them and enable the state to commit violence and shed innocent blood. But at the end of the day, as we go through these challenges together, we may have times where we're stressed, where we feel powerless or hopeless, but it is important to remember we're actually extremely powerful. We make choices every single day, and these hundreds of choices add up to a powerful influence on ourselves and our community. We have our actions of body. What do we do with our physical body every day? We have our speech. Do our words uplift and unite the community, or do they bring more discord? And then we have the power of thought. Our way of thinking is going to lead to our actions and our speech. If we can create an accepting, open, and compassionate mind that uses discernment and reasoned judgment, we'll be harnessing our own inner power to literally transform the world through everything we do each day. So that's what I wanted to share, and thank you all for listening.